opportunity for her conversation with women. We invite all women to come. If you don't have a brown bag, there are other brown bags that will be there, and we know how to share a cookie here, an apple there. So I invite you to stay for that. We'll be meeting for 1 hour and then moving on to the rest of our day. One of the many contributions of the Jewish faith that the Jewish faith has given its companions in the religious world is the concept of Tinkum Olam, which means the repair of the world. 17th century Jewish mystic Isaac Luria spins the story that describes Tinkum Olam. In the beginning, he says, the creator of the universe, deciding to make a world, drew in the divine breath, contracted, in order to make room for the creation coming into being. In this enlarged space, the creator then set vessels, and into the vessels poured the brilliance of the divine light. The light was too brilliant for the vessels, however, and unable to contain it, they shattered all over the universe. Since that time, the story continues, the work of the human beings has been to go about the universe, picking up the shards of creation and trying to mend and transform the vessels by refashioning them in a work known as the repair of the world. In her work on the theology of the spiritual life, on her work on Christian practices, and her work on the linkage between the honoring of body and the honoring of God, Stephanie Pausell has immersed herself in this vocation of Tinkum Olam. And while her other work has certainly been a gift to us, it is the deeply inspired reflection upon the spirituality of the intellectual life which simply catches our breath. As she has helped us see the integral bond between the intellectual practice of reading and the vocation of Tinkum Olam, the very breath of the Holy One has massaged our hearts again. It is with humble gratitude and open hearts that we welcome Dr. Pausell to this podium today as we seek the source of inscribed hearts that are shaped by the spiritual practice of the intellectual work. Let us welcome her again.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for that beautiful introduction. And it's great to see you all again, and I look forward to continuing our conversation today. I'd like to begin this morning by asking you to imagine yourself in a room where a woman is sitting at a table before a blank page. Or maybe she's standing up at a desk. The year is 1286, and our vision can't be very clear from such a distance. But imagine that you can see that she holds a goose quill pen in one hand and a knife for sharpening it and scraping away mistakes in the other. These tools rest easily in her hands because she is a member of an order dedicated to the production of books, and she uses these tools every day. She is a Carthusian nun, and like her Carthusian brothers and sisters, she believes that the contemplative and active dimensions of the Christian life can be united in the work of the scribe. Copying the works of others protects the solitude of the monastic cell from more intrusive forms of ministry. But it also allows silent monks and nuns to preach, as the Carthusians like to put it, with their hands. It allows them to reach across the boundaries of geography and time, to be in intimate communion with people they will never meet, but whom they hope to lead to God. The tools and the work of the scribe are very familiar to this woman, but the work she plans to do today is not. Today she does not take up her pen as a copyist. Now, if you can draw a little closer to this woman, you'll see that her eyes are rimmed with shadows, for she has not slept or eaten well for several days. She is, in fact, reeling in the aftermath of an experience of God's presence, for which she is profoundly grateful, but which has left her exhausted and ill. Several days earlier, the words of lamentation in a pre-Lenten liturgy had made her anxious about her salvation, an anxiety she attempted to resolve through further meditation on Scripture. Her meditation led her to prayer, in the midst of which God came to her all full of sweetness, and she felt herself changed and renewed. But the God known by this woman is a God who writes, an author whose chosen parchment is the human heart. Her own heart is now congested with God's writing and overburdened with the response to it that is taking shape within her. She believes she will die if she cannot relieve her wounded heart, but she is afraid of losing what her heart contains. And so, knowing that she is about to depart from her role as a scribe, she puts her pen to the page and begins to write, probably for the first time, without a text from which to copy. She writes in Latin, the language of the liturgy with which her life is permeated and the literature that nourishes her prayer, although she breaks into the vernacular now and then when she can't make Latin say what she wants it to say. And as she writes, not only is her festering heart soothed, but she finds that the act of writing brings her to another experience of God, an experience of God working in her. She acknowledges that it is impossible to find accurate words to describe divinity, but her pen nevertheless gathers up images for God as it moves across the page. Mother, father, brother, friend, creator, judge, blessed food, true refreshment, precious stone, mirror into which the angels peer, the medicine, physician, health itself, fragrant rose, life of the soul. Now, imagine time passing and one century giving way to another. Imagine meeting the same woman, older now, at her desk again. If you can come close enough to look over her shoulder, you'll see that she is composing a letter this time, not in Latin, but in the vernacular of her correspondent. She's no longer writing in Latin. It's no longer the language of her growing body of writings. She writes now most often in her native Franco-Provençal, but she knows enough French to maintain a correspondence with friends and fellow religious who do not share her dialect. As she writes, we see that she is still preoccupied with the way a word can wound a heart, can inscribe itself so deeply that it swells and festers there. She tells her correspondent a story about a woman who is deeply vulnerable to the power of words. Hearing the word vehement in pious conversation, it becomes lodged in her heart and she can't think about anything else. She believes that if she could only understand this word, she would find relief from the pressure that it is causing inside of her. Somebody tells her that vehement means strong, but that doesn't really help. Finally, she prays to God to teach her the word's meaning and remove it from her heart. Before she can finish her prayer, God answers her in such a way that she seems to be standing in a desert. She sees before her a dry and dying tree at the foot of a solitary mountain. The leaves on its drooping branches are inscribed with the names of the 5 senses. Sight is written on the leaves of the first branch, hearing on the leaves of the second, taste on the third, smell on the fourth, touch on the 5th. A large circle like the round bottom of a barrel rests on top of the tree, keeping out everything the tree needs to live, the sun, the rain, the dew. The woman gazes at the tree and then lifts her eyes to the mountain. She sees a great stream rushing from the mountain toward the tree with such strength that the tree is uprooted and replanted upside down. With its top in the ground, the roots of the tree turn upwards, its branches reach toward the sky, its once dry leaves become green and lush. Suddenly a door opens, and the woman looks up from her writing. There's a problem in the fields, or in the kitchen, or with one of the sisters. She's the prioress of her community now, so matters are her responsibility. She puts down her pen and leaves the room. We can't see how the letter ends, whether the vision has brought healing to the woman with vehement written on her heart. The vision itself, however, suggests that when the woman makes herself available to God's own vehement presence, the stifling, oppressive weight of the word will be lifted. For the vehement river of God restores not only the 5 physical senses, but reaches even deeper, to a place where expression and understanding are intertwined. The woman in the letter is wounded by a word because she cannot understand it. The woman writing the letter seems to say that it is in the work of expression, in the struggle to unite human and divine creativity, that understanding begins. This portrait of a medieval woman writing is of a woman named Marguerite Doint, whom I mentioned yesterday, a Carthusian nun in southern France who died in 1310. I first read her collected works in 1987, in my first year of language study. Writing in 3 languages, she posed an almost insurmountable obstacle to my fledgling language skills. I would spend hours over a sentence, over a phrase, trying to figure out what she was saying. I felt like I was standing outside an unfamiliar house with dirty windows and slowly wiping away the grime until I could see what was inside. What I've described above is what I found. The story of a woman who sought God through the practice of writing, who wrote to understand God and language and the world around her, a writer whose every word was a response to what God had written on her heart. The rest of the way through my graduate studies, Marguerite was my constant companion, not just as the subject of my dissertation, but also as a challenge to me as a writer. Marguerite worked hard to forge an authorial identity in the midst of a culture that often mistrusted women's writing, and she pushed me to embrace the identity of a writer as well. Writing matters, she seemed to say. On days when cleaning my apartment seemed preferable to working on my dissertation, she goaded me. Do your work, she said. Writing is your work. Finishing a degree or getting a grade is the least of it, she said. Write to learn, to understand, to communicate with another, to seek what is real and true. For Marguerite, writing was a spiritual practice, one of the ways she sought to deepen her relationship with God. As a theological teacher, I've tried to let Marguerite's voice penetrate the often competing commitments of my vocation to remind me why writing is important. So many things conspire to obscure writing's potential to be for us a spiritual discipline. If we are students, our writing is constantly being evaluated, graded, critiqued. We are writing against the deadlines of the quarter system or the semester, often on several disparate topics at once. If we are teachers, writing is the currency we trade for tenure, for promotion, for jobs. And so the usual terrors of sitting down to a blank page are multiplied many times over. We must produce to advance. Many departments require that faculty list the number of pages of each book and article on their vitae, as if the accumulation of pages were a good in itself. In recent years, many thoughtful voices in theological education have sought to question the Academy's commodification of writing and its embrace of publications as the central criterion for advancement. The critique of these practices, however, has unfortunately sometimes led to the conviction that writing is the opposite of teaching. The teacher who writes is imagined as one forever turning away from students, away from colleagues, away from responsibilities, in order to sit alone in a room and write. New graduates on the job market are imagined, as they were described in an article in the Christian Century a few years ago, as mercenaries who don't care where they teach, as long as they have time to do their research and writing. The constant murmur of faculty complaint that there is no time for writing is heard often as an inability to shake free of the sticky hegemony of our graduate education, a reluctance to embrace wholeheartedly the vocation of the teacher. Of course, having to write in order to stay employed does force us to embrace the discipline of writing when we might otherwise not ever make time for it. And the critique of those who seem to disappear into their writing, leaving no energy for the classroom or for work with colleagues, does remind us that the vocation of the theological teacher is made up not only of the work we do alone, but the work we do together. But neither of these ways of articulating the relationship of writing to our vocation offers any clue as to how writing might be embraced as part of our spiritual formation and the formation of our students, who are also writers. Indeed, the twin problems of the commodification of writing and the suspicion of writing in theological education obscure the ways in which writing might be practiced as creative, meditative, intellectual activity that might gradually change our lives. In the time that remains, I want to suggest some ways in which writing might be embraced as such an activity, as a discipline within which we might meet God. Now, making writing an integral part of the vocation of theological teachers and students is not easy, and not only because there is so little time in our day for it. Writing is frequently unbearable, not only because of the work it must do on behalf of our careers, but because it is so difficult, because we are not always able to find the right words, because language is never quite under our control. Marguerite Doink shifted back and forth between languages, trying to say what she meant. Anyone who has ever tried to express something one is interiorly convinced of in spoken or written words can identify with Augustine's complaint. "I am saddened," he once wrote, "that my words cannot suffice to my heart." Writing theologically, writing words about God, presents even more difficulties. When ancient and medieval Christian writers tried to describe the difficulties of writing theologically, they often quoted Psalm 115, verse 11, "Omnis homo mendax," everyone is a liar. Augustine, one of the most persistent worriers over language, laments that there is no way of speaking and writing of God that is completely true. One can never speak fast enough to say Father, Son, and Holy Spirit at the same time. And no matter how one writes it, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit always occupy separate spaces on the page. For Augustine, writing is but a poor human remedy for the way spoken syllables strike the air and then immediately pass away. We try to catch them with our pen, but even after we fasten them to the page, they refuse to say precisely what we'd hoped. Of course, these worries over the inadequacy of language never stopped Augustine from writing. Indeed, in response to the dilemma, he seemed to write more and more. He came at the same ideas over and over, recasting them in different forms, putting them in conversation with different texts, burnishing them with his pen until they glowed. For writers like Marguerite Doink and Augustine, writing required the combination of audacity and humility. More audacity, perhaps, for Marguerite, more humility, I think, for Augustine. Audacity for attempting to write anything of God at all. Humility because all one's attempts will have to be revised, and even then will never be wholly satisfactory. It is precisely this need for both audacity and humility in approaching the blank page that opens a space for writing to become for us one of the spiritual disciplines from which our life as theological teachers and theological students might take its shape. We need the audacity to believe our writing matters, to stick with a difficult task, to live a life that makes room for the discipline of writing. We also need the humility to know that our writing must always be under revision, to do slow, painstaking work with no immediate external rewards, to be willing to seek and receive the critical response of others. Allowing writing to focus our attention, we may have our capacity for attention honed and increased. As we discussed yesterday, Simone Weil famously wrote that academic work, when pursued with the love of God as its end and practiced as a set of tasks that require us to be rigorously attentive to what is not ourselves, is nearly sacramental because it increases our capacity for attention. Without attention, she insists, we can neither pray nor be present to those who suffer. Every effort put forth in learning languages, in solving mathematical problems, or grappling with ideas in reading and writing could bear fruit, she argues, in prayer and in our relationship with others. For Weil, academic work done not for some external reward, but out of a desire for a deeper life with God and others is a pearl of great price, worthy of the sacrifice of our time and resources to pursue. Now, writing is an academic task that can sharpen our capacity for attention, but in a slightly different way from learning a language or solving a mathematical problem. Those activities require us to enter into a logic wholly outside of ourselves, a grammar that is not our own. Writing can also require us to enter into unfamiliar ways of thinking, depending on what we are writing about. But it also requires us to make choices from a wider array than if we are struggling to translate from Latin into English or to untie the knots of a mathematical problem. When we write, we must constantly make choices, this word instead of that word, this form, this voice, this tone. Weil says that there is a way of waiting when we are writing for the right word to come of itself at the end of our pen, while we merely reject all inadequate words. But how do we know the right word when it comes? On what basis do we make our choice? We are only able to recognize a word as the right one if we are attending closely to the words with which we are working, to what they mean, to how they sound, to what is evoked when one is placed next to another. We only know the right word if we have a feel for what we are writing and for whom we are writing. We only know the right word if we have been living with our ideas in our reading, our conversation, and our meditation. Faye's image of the writer waiting for the right word to spill out of her pen makes it sound as if a first draft can be a final draft. But that is hardly ever the case, and in my case, it is never the case. I am comforted in this matter by Botticelli's image of Augustine writing in his cell. If you've been to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Italy, you know there's this wonderful room of Botticelli's, of big colorful paintings of Venus, rising up out of the waves. And in the corner, which you must go see next time you're there, there's a tiny little painting of Augustine in his cell. And in this picture, Botticelli imagines Augustine at his desk writing. But there are no angels whispering the right word into his ears. There's no ghostly hand guiding his. Instead, there is a floor littered with broken quills and balled up pieces of paper, signs of Augustine's having to abandon a draft and start again, of having to try again and again to work out in writing something true about God. And although, in truth, Augustine probably most likely dictated his writings to a scribe, Botticelli is right about one thing. There are traces in his writing of his having gone over and over his words, trying to get it Sometimes the most difficult thing about writing is staying with it as the wads of crumpled up paper accumulate around us. For most of us, writing is slow daily work. I do have one friend who reads and reads and reads and reads, and then over a weekend can produce a chapter or a paper that is rigorously argued and brilliantly articulated, a thing of beauty. But this kind of virtuosity is really rare, I think. So disciplined is her mind and so exhaustive is her reading. She reads absolutely everything. She's the one person who can read all the books on a particular topic. That the constant conversation between books and ideas that shapes her life allows her writing to unscroll inside of her long before her fingers touch the computer keys. I have often wished I could write this way. But the truth is, I write in order to do what my friend does through reading and thinking. I write to figure things out. A minister with whom I once worked used to explain church rituals to me like this. He said, "We don't do these things because we know exactly what they mean. We do them in order to find out what they mean." That is what writing is for me, I think. Writing can be a kind of reading. Writing can be a kind of thinking, a way of receiving and considering the work of others, a way of discovering what we think about particular questions, a way of articulating what we think in a way that invites others into the process of reading, thinking, and articulating. So it really matters what words we choose, what voice we speak in, what tone we take. It matters both for the quality of our own thought and for the quality of our invitation to our readers. The intellectual and aesthetic choices we make when we write are also moral, spiritual choices that can hold a door open for another to enter or can slam that door shut, that can sharpen our thinking or allow it to recline on a comfortable bed of jargon, that can form us in generosity and humility or in condescension and disdain. With so much at stake, no wonder revision is such an indispensable part of writing. Even my friend, who writes a first draft so quickly and so well, painstakingly revises until she can hardly bear to look at her words one more time. It is revision that leads Kathleen Norris to call writing a way of life that requires continual conversion. No matter how much I've written or published, Norris writes, I always return to the blank page and to the blankness within, the fears, laziness, and cowardice that without fail will mess up whatever I'm currently writing and in turn require me to revise it. The spiritual dimension of this process is humility, not a quality often associated with writers, she says, but lurking there in our nagging sense of the need to revise. When we revise our writing, we listen for the false notes. We watch for signs of an incomplete train of thought. We read with an eye for our own failures. While it is deeply pleasurable to improve a piece of writing, it is not always easy to contemplate our paragraphs of cluttered thinking and blurry sentences. It is even more difficult to submit our writing to another, a colleague, a spouse, a teacher, a friend, and ask them to show us our mistakes. But this is where we have the choicest opportunity to sharpen the faculty of attention that Simone Weil describes. For we have to hold our writing lightly in those moments. We have at the same time to be convinced of its importance and willing to change it radically or even crumple it up and toss it out. We have to care about it enough to make it better, while at the same time cultivating a detachment toward it. The combination of loving attention with detachment is a spiritual discipline of long standing in many religious traditions. We have an opportunity, in a small way, to cultivate it through our writing. All of this, of course, takes time. And who has an excess of time? Certainly not the theological teacher, who must respond to students and colleagues, church and academy, community, and oftentimes family. And theological students, well, you know, you have nearly as many competing commitments, juggling classes and field education, family and community, reading and writing. For theological teachers and students, writing cannot happen in our spare time because we don't have any spare time. Writing must be made part of the daily practice of our vocation, like grading papers, like sitting on committees, like attending classes. Just as if we are going to practice daily prayer, we have to live a life that has room for prayer. If we are going to write, we have to learn to live a life that has room for writing. Annie Dillard notes that a work in progress quickly becomes feral. It reverts to a wild state overnight. I'm seeing heads nodding. Part of shaping a life that has room for writing is to learn to write every day. A simple lesson, but one I am constantly having to relearn. Like any spiritual discipline, we must practice it regularly in order for it to do its work on us, to form us in attention, to draw us ever more deeply into the life of the world. If we do not tend our writing daily, we are always starting over, always gearing up for it. When we write daily, even in small snatches of time, we come each day to a more or less well-tended garden. We know where things are planted. We see where we might prune and trim. We sense where we need to dig more deeply. If we visit our writing only on the weekends or the holidays or during the all-nighter before a paper is due, we have to cut our way through brambles and weeds trying to recover the seed of our idea. Of course, it is so much easier for me to tell you this than to practice it. I am such a beginner at the spiritual discipline of writing. I am always beginning again, always recommitting myself to the task. Marguerite Doint complains in her letters that the work of running a monastery keeps her from writing all she would like to write, as well as she would like to write it. But she keeps at it, starting over and over, first in one language, then in another, trying to practice writing as a way of learning something about God and about her life with God, trying to find a place within God's creativity for her own. Our goals are perhaps more modest: to explicate a complicated text, to narrate an historical moment that sheds light on our contemporary situation, to argue for a theological position. But in the ordinary daily work of exegesis, narration, and argument, we learn to hold in our attention both what we study and what we think about what we study, what it means for us and what it might mean for others. Choosing our words with care each day, we nourish the soil of our vocation and perhaps, on occasion, catch a glimpse of a creativity that makes our choices possible. Now, in the dichotomized conversations we often have in theological education about teaching and writing is often portrayed as isolating work. I'm sure that never happens here, but other places I have visited. Theological teachers write only to please their respective guilds, according to some. Our writing diverts our attention from our classroom, from the life of our institution. It is only in our teaching and in our work with our colleagues and students that we live in relationship, some say. In writing, we separate ourselves from the community. Now, certainly, it is possible to practice writing as a way to distance ourselves from our lives as teachers and colleagues. But if we practice writing as a spiritual discipline, our writing ought to deepen our life in community. This does not mean that teachers will not need to apply for sabbatical grants, to ask our institutions for time off to complete sustained writing projects. This does not mean that teachers and students will not need to protect part of every day for writing. It means that in our writing, our engagement with the world will not and should not stop at the boundaries of our own lives. Some of the richest descriptions of how writing leads us into the life of the world can be found among the most cloistered of people. Medieval monks often thought of writing, by which they usually meant the production of, not the production of original manuscripts, but the copying of the manuscripts of others. They often thought of it as manual labor, as indeed it was in an age when all bookmaking was done completely by hand. For the Carthusians, the order of which Marguerite Doint was a part, writing was understood as silent manual labor, which performs works in great hiddenness. Writing gave the Carthusians an active form of ministry. Through writing, cloistered monks and nuns moved about in the world, traveling wherever their books and letters traveled, offering nourishment to persons they would never meet, putting them into relationship with persons who may not have even yet been born. Practicing writing as a spiritual discipline means holding potential readers and the other writers with whom we think and write in our hearts. Writing is work we do alone, certainly. We sit before a blank screen, a blank page, and slowly we begin to arrange words on it. But writing is also work we do with others. Like the medieval copyists we have before us, in our memories and imaginations, if not right on our desk, the works of others. We respond to that work, we argue with it, we reshape it in order to help us construct our own work. And we write towards others, reaching out to them from the scaffolding of our words. When we write with attention, we write in and for community. Before I got swept into medieval studies by the thought of being able to recover neglected women's writing, as the dean said yesterday, I had hoped to study Virginia Woolf. What interested me about Woolf was this, that for her, writing seemed to be a spiritual practice, a practice that helped her explore what was really real. Although not a theist by any means, Virginia Woolf does write of something just beyond her grasp, something she senses even in the midst of her profound depressions, something she seeks when she writes. It is not oneself, she writes in her diary, but something in the universe that one's left with. One sees a fin passing far out. Virginia Woolf believed that we are all wadded in by the cotton wool of non-being, which is occasionally punctured by what she calls moments of being that hit with the force of a sledgehammer. It is her own susceptibility to these moments of being that Woolf believed made her a writer. She has a revelation, often painful, of some real thing behind appearances. And, she writes, I make it real by putting it into words. It is only by putting it into words, she writes, that it has lost the power to hurt me. It gives me, perhaps because by doing so I take away the pain, a great delight to put the severed parts together. Perhaps this is the strongest pleasure known to me. It is the rapture I get when in writing I seem to be discovering what belongs to what. Her daily practice of writing gives birth to what she calls her philosophy, which she articulates in the rhythms of a creed. She believes, she writes, that behind the cotton wool is hidden a pattern, that we, I mean all human beings, are connected with this, that the whole world is a work of art, that we are parts of the work of art. Hamlet, she writes, or a Beethoven quartet, is the truth about this vast mass we call the world. But there is no Shakespeare, there is no Beethoven, certainly and emphatically there is no God. We are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself. This philosophy of hers drives her vocation as a writer. I prove this now, she writes in her memoir, by spending the morning writing, when I might be walking, running a shop, or learning to do something that will be useful if war comes. And war was coming. World War II was coming. I feel, she writes, that by writing I am doing what is far more necessary than anything else. Now, doing what is far more necessary than anything else, isn't that what we want to discover? Isn't that what we want to shape our lives and our vocations as theological teachers and as students preparing for ministry? You know what it feels like when you are doing something that is necessary to do. Teachers cherish those moments in our classrooms when we seem to reach our students in a way that matters, when they find their voices and engage the material we often with passion, when they come alive to all the ways what they study could shape their ministries. If you are a student, you also know what it feels like when you are doing the thing that is necessary to do. You know how it feels when someone comes to you, the student pastor, with a grave and serious problem of life, and there is no time to go check your favorite book on pastoral care or call Dr. Sherrard for advice, but yet you manage to bring forth the word and provide the presence that the person needs in that moment. It is perhaps more difficult to know how necessary our writing is. No eyes look back into our eyes. No one breaks in with questions. No one interrupts to take our thinking to a higher level. We don't always know who will read our writing. Sometimes we don't know if it will be read at all. Practicing writing as a spiritual discipline requires acts of faith and imagination. We must care about our readers, no matter how anonymous they are. We must, like Wolfe, discover in our writing how to reunite what has been severed, to connect what seems disparate, to create out of a diversity of material and perspective some new thing. Writers are lovers, Virginia Woolf suggests in To the Lighthouse, her wonderful novel, which if you haven't read, rush right out and get it. There might be lovers, she says, whose gift it was to choose out the elements of things and place them together, and so, giving them a wholeness not theirs in life, make of some scene or meeting of people, all now gone and separate, one of those globed, compacted things over which thought lingers and love plays. To write in such a way as to invite both thought and love is to write on behalf of others. It is to practice writing as a spiritual discipline that has the good of others at its heart. It is to write in a way that exposes one's hopes and motivations, to write in a way that betrays one's love. It is to write in a language that invites rather than excludes, in forms that are full of doors through which a reader might walk. To write this way requires time and a certain measure of solitude. But it also requires that each writing project begin and end with others, both those near at hand and those we may never know, but to whom and for whom we write. Now, how might we teach and practice writing as a spiritual discipline, especially in theological schools, especially in places like this? Will this work only for the good writers, only for the students and teachers for whom writing comes easily? And who are these people? We don't like them. Certainly not. All we need is the desire to sharpen our attention through attending to words and the desire to write towards others. All of us can write with attention. And how might we enter this discipline? I'm afraid there's only one way: by writing every day. Teachers can encourage this by varying their assignments, and I think wonderful work is done here already in this, just from talking to you all about what you're doing. Short papers, journals, in-class writing assignments, reviews of the writing of others. All of this can accustom us to daily writing and hopefully introduce us to the pleasure of it. Asking students to explore the same idea in several forms, in an academic paper and in a sermon, for example, can show students how different forms give rise to different thoughts, how it is possible to learn through writing. Reading and critiquing each other's writing can further sharpen our attention to words and to others, and help shape not only generous writers, but generous spirited readers as well. We should also be willing to talk with each other, teachers and students alike, about writing, about the frustrations and excitements we experience in writing. We should model writing as a way of reading, a way of receiving the world that turns what we read and experience over and over in the crucible of language until we learn something new and say something meaningful. Whether we are writing our exegesis paper for Dr. Davison, or a paper for the American Academy of Religion, or a sermon for Sunday, writing is too difficult and too potentially transformative for us to write out of motives other than love and generosity. Now, this does not mean that we should not write critically or polemically or prophetically, but it does mean that we should write in a way that betrays what we care most deeply about, to write in a way that betrays our love. For the contemporary American novelist Carol Maso, the act of fixing words on a page is itself an act of love. Every moment of life, she writes, is a precious, disappearing thing, to which one says when one writes, stay a little, to which one says when one writes, I love you. Our years in school are an irreplaceable chance for us to grow intimate with language, to find a voice that's true, to write in a way that betrays our love. If we embrace writing as a spiritual practice, it will bear fruit in every form of our ministries, in our scholarship, in our sermons, in our liturgies and prayers, in our pastoral care. If we write from any other motive than to find out what belongs to what, or to heal and reunite, or to reach across boundaries, or to seek communion with others, or to respond to what is written on our hearts, or to peel back the cotton wool of non-being, or to seek the real behind appearances, or to illuminate invisible connections, or to open a path between solitude and community, or to find God, then writing will not change us. Nor will we know the rapture Virginia Woolf speaks of, or the deep understanding Marguerite Doink describes. The very best writing emerges from generosity, from the desire to meet and nourish another. No matter how inadequate our words may seem to us, in our struggle to find the right ones, we make room for others to find words of their own. Thank you. We have a little bit of time yet for questions, if anyone has any comment. I know there are writers in our midst. Many of you have told me that you are writers and poets and probably know a lot more about this than I do, so please. I'd love to hear what you are thinking. Yes?
Yes, I have a question about, you talk about the daily discipline of writing. I don't know how many times I've sat with a journal, and finally after a few minutes just went, okay. I'd like to hear some thoughts about how to begin to take the blank page and possibly the blank mind and begin to work at that.
That's a great question, how to get started. Because I have this problem too. Sometimes you sit down, the blank page, it's this big moment and you're going to put your great thoughts down, but unfortunately you just don't have any great thoughts at the moment. And, I think there are lots of different ways to go about this, and there are lots of very helpful exercises out there that can help you with this. Lots of books on this topic. One thing, an interesting thing that's a little bit unusual, I think, as an answer to this question, but there's a novelist I really like a lot named Janet Kaufman. She's odd, and it's hard to find her books. But I always rejoice when I find one because she's very interesting. And she says that she had that problem. And that what fixed it for her was finally coming to understand that language was not this, unmaterial thing. That when she sat down to write, it was like being a carpenter or something, that you sit down with your materials, only your materials happen to be paper and pen and words. And that once she got a sense of this as something physical she was doing, it became easier. I've wondered about that. I think that's a really interesting idea. But there are lots of good suggestions for how to get going. Some people say if you just start writing about what you had for breakfast, that if you just make your hand keep moving over the page, you're going to be surprised with what comes out. That, there's I think Peter Elbow is a great writer on writing, great writing teacher. Has a lot of exercises sort of that he calls free writing, where you just say, okay, I'm going to write a page. You set yourself more a material limit than a limit based on ideas or images or something. And you just start writing you can even just start writing, I have nothing to say, I have absolutely nothing to say, what am I doing sitting here with this notebook? And that if you just make yourself keep going, that stuff will come up. There's the famous, what's her name, the Artist's Way person? Julia Cameron, right, who has the morning pages practice, which I know a lot of people who do this, and my mother used to do this long before Julia Cameron. But getting up in the morning and just, my mother was a typewriter. I would hear it in the morning through my bedroom wall when I woke up, but that you just get up in the morning and you just start writing before you've really allowed yourself to wake up. You say, okay, I'm going to do 3 pages every morning when I wake up, and I'm just going to roll out of bed and put my pen down and just start writing. And that the idea is that you're going to write a lot of stuff that you don't care about, but that maybe in those 3 pages there's going to be the grain of something. And I think, those of you who are students, you know how it is when you're writing a paper. Sometimes you just have to sit down and physically get going in order to, for things to start coming out. That moment never goes away, unfortunately. But I think you've got to think of it as this physical act that you're going to get going and let your body lead the way in a way. And hopefully your mind will follow. And I think it's amazingly the mind almost always does. But you have to, in order for your creativity to come out, you have to open a space for it to be. So you have to keep the book open. And you have to keep, you have to say, okay, I'm going to fill up a page no matter if I'm writing about the most mundane things. My sister called the other night and said that her son, who's in kindergarten, who, he doesn't know a lot about reading and writing yet, that their teacher is having them keep a journal. And that every day, Theo was writing what he had for breakfast. This is his thing. And the teacher said, that's great. And he'll start there, and you'll just be amazed where he goes from breakfast. So, as usual, we learn from the kindergarten teachers most of all. Yes?
If I might make a suggestion, there's a book titled Writing Down the Bones, Natalie Goldberg, that comes from Zen Buddhist tradition that offers a number of snippets.
Yes.
On how to get started.
Thank you very much. Yes.
While I have the floor, may I
Please.
ask you something? I thought your talk was excellent, by the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The quote from Kathleen Norris interested me a great deal. That writing is a way of life that requires continual conversion. I'm thinking about writing a piece on conversion that shows up in literary texts, being really more of literary person than a theologian.
Right.
Would you say some more about that? Writing as a way that requires continual conversion. You talk about process.
Right. Well, she's talking in particular about humility, and that because writing requires so much revision, that it requires us to participate in, a form of humility. We have to submit ourselves to the critique of others or to our own critique. And, we have to hold our writing loosely enough to change it. But I think also your question is reflects a good answer to that as well, that, we have to, even when it's just our mind feels dead. I mean, it's very like prayer, isn't it? You have to stick with it. Sometimes we go to pray and we feel nothing. We feel this dry desert. We feel no presence there waiting for us. But the great mystics tell us, if you keep going back day after day, even in the midst of that dryness, you are forging that relationship. And it's the same with writing, I think. You open the journal and you sit there with your pen and you give it a little while and nothing comes and you close the journal. The practice that I think requires continual conversion is making yourself stay there with the pages open and writing.
Thomas Merton is another very good one to look at, I think, in addition to Virginia Woolf.
Yes, right.
Notion of doing it on a daily basis.
Right. Thank you very much. I don't know if everyone heard the first suggestion. Natalie Goldberg, who is a Zen Buddhist writer on writing, has has books with exercises that are very helpful. Yes?
A lot of times when I do blank, words and phrases, just words and phrases and sketches. Sometimes I just make a sketch and it don't. But I wanted to ask you about Virginia Woolf. You mentioned her memoirs.
Yeah.
Did you mention a second book? Because I was
Yeah.
taking notes and I'd appreciate
Yeah.
that.
The novel I mentioned was To the Lighthouse, which is about a painter. But you can see that as she's writing about a painter, she's thinking about her vocation as a writer. And the memoir is in a book collected. She never published it. It wasn't published in our lifetime. It was a kind of a sketch for a memoir. But it's published in a book called Moments of Being, and it's called A Sketch of the Past. And of course, she wrote just volumes and volumes of diaries and letters. They're just great. My mom got me started on those when I was in college. They're just great.